Hello everyone, welcome to this lecture on water scarcity beyond the numbers. I am Kartik Omanakuttan. I am an editorial professional at the Grassroots Institute and a PhD research scholar at the Soban Singh Jinnah University in India. Since you have already studied the previous units of Module 1 and have come this far, you are now familiar with the historical transformation and contemporary governance of aquatic ecosystems that focus on how these biological systems are degraded, fragmented, and unevenly appropriated under modern development trajectories, right? Rather than mere ecological descriptions, you have studied that this unit situates water biology within the political ecology, highlighting that degradation is often a cumulative and path dependent process. You're now mostly familiar with the common topics of water biology, such as eutrophication and thresholds, water ecology, and biodiversity. In today's session, we will move beyond simple biology to explore the political and governance dimensions of aquatic health. We will learn why are rivers and oceans often treated as managed waste sinks rather than living systems. Our lecture will cover the signs of ecosystem degradation and the tipping points of eutrophication, the governance mismatches that allow pollution to persist, real world crisis examples, the three dimensions of connectivity and how infrastructure like dams they disrupt them. Then finally, the social inequalities inherent in who benefits from water use and who bears the cost of its ruin. Let's begin without any delay. Okay, so the today's lecture is actually divided into six parts, which are ecosystem degradation, ecological and health, then the toxic crisis, then we'll discuss about global coral bleaching, the governance mismatches, and aquatic connectivity. But before we proceed to the part one, it is very essential to recall two important topics which we will try to correlate with all the other concepts of this lecture, which is first the water quality and secondly the aquatic biodiversity. Regarding water quality, you now have already understood that the natural water is much more than just H2 molecules. It carries this chemical signature of everywhere it has traveled through isotropic fingerprints. That is the isotopes of hydrogen, deuterium, and oxygen. These can be tracked. As water evaporates and condenses at varying temperatures and altitudes, it takes on a specific isotopic ratio. This acts as an elevation and climate barcode, allowing scientists to pinpoint exactly where it fell as rain or snow. Then there are dissolved minerals, sediments, fertilizers, and radioactive isotopes that can be traced back to their origin. Water quality depends on its intended use, whether for drinking, agriculture, or supporting ecosystems. In many cases, poor quality makes water effectively unavailable, even if there's plenty of it. And finally, remember that clear looking water is not always safe because many harmful contaminants are completely invisible to our eyes. Then you learned about pH. That pH of a water body affects how toxic certain substances become and whether aquatic organisms can survive in it or not. Then electrical conductivity, it gives us an idea of the amount of the dissolved salts and ions in the water. Biochemical oxygen demand, the BOD, it tells us how much oxygen microorganisms need to break down organic matter. Higher BOD usually means more pollution. If the dissolved oxygen drops below about 2 mg per liter, aquatic life struggles to survive, creating what we call dead zones. And finally, excess nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus can cause eutrophication, leading to algal blooms and severe oxygen depletion. Then, aquatic biodiversity. A river isn't just a channel carrying water, it's a living ecosystem where countless organisms interact with one another. For this ecosystem to function properly, it needs connectivity in three dimensions, that is, first along the river from the headwater to the sea, then across to the floodplains, and finally between surface water and groundwater. When these connections are disrupted, biodiversity begins to decline. It is important to remember one more thing that biodiversity loss usually happens gradually, with each new disturbance making it harder for the ecosystem to recover. Freshwater biodiversity is actually under serious pressure. Today, about 1 in 4 freshwater species is threatened with extinction. Every species that disappears weakens the food web, making the entire ecosystem less stable and less resilient. Another major problem is hydrological fragmentation. Dams and water diversions have disrupted more than 60% of the world's large rivers, altering natural flow patterns that many fishes rely on for breeding and that rivers need for moving sediments. On top of that, invasive species such as zebra mussels can spread rapidly, harming native biodiversity and causing enormous economic damage by clogging water infrastructure. Now, the first part of our lecture today, that is ecosystem degradation. Let's discuss biological integrity first. Simply put, biological integrity refers to an ecosystem's ability to maintain a healthy, balanced, and self sustaining community of organisms, much like it would do under natural conditions. When an ecosystem is degraded, it gradually loses this biological integrity. As that happens, it becomes less capable of providing important ecosystem services such as reducing floods, naturally purifying water, supporting fisheries, supplying clean fresh water, and even offering recreational and cultural benefits that people value. One important thing to understand is that ecosystem degradation is usually a gradual process. There are various kind of key characteristics and primary drivers that the interacting pressure shape ecosystem fate, such as cumulative stress, path dependent trajectories, and thresholds. To describe them, cumulative means that each new stress, whether it's pollution, habitat destruction, or water diversion, these add to the damage that's already there. And as degradation continues, recovery becomes increasingly difficult and expensive because the system starts reinforcing its own decline. Hence, we call it path dependent trajectory. Eventually, the ecosystem may reach a tipping point or its threshold where it suddenly shifts into a completely different state, such as a clear lake becoming permanently cloudy and oxygen poor. Once that happens, restoring the original ecosystem is extremely challenging. Then there are several major drivers or factors that drive the degradation of aquatic ecosystem. Excess nutrients from agriculture can cause eutrophication. We all know that. And harmful algal blooms as well. Chemical pollutants and disease causing microorganisms contaminate water and disrupt aquatic life. And human activities such as building dams and diverting rivers change natural water flow. Then invasive species, they are very important as they compete with or they replace the native organisms and thus disrupt the food webs. And finally, climate change, it adds further stress by increasing water temperature and altering water chemistry, making it harder for many species to survive. The eutrophication. Let's see how eutrophication actually happens. It begins when excess nutrients, uh, nutrients means here nitrogen and phosphorus specifically, which are mostly from the agricultural fertilizers or agricultural runoffs. When excess nitrogen and phosphorus they enter rivers and lakes through runoffs, these nutrients act like fuel, causing rapid algal blooms. As the algae multiply, they block sunlight from reaching aquatic plants below the surface. When the algae eventually die, bacteria decompose them, using up large amounts of dissolved oxygen. This can reduce oxygen to very low levels, creating hypoxic conditions or dead zone where most fish and other aquatic organisms cannot survive. An important concept in ecology is the tipping point. Ecosystems don't always deteriorate gradually. Once a specific nutrient threshold is crossed, a lake can suddenly flip from a clear water plant dominated state to a turbid and phytoplankton dominated state. But why? Why is recovery of such an ecosystem so difficult? Turns out sometimes once nutrient levels cross a certain threshold, a clear and healthy lake can suddenly shift into a permanently cloudy and algae dominated one. After this shift, the ecosystem develops feedback loops, that is self reinforcement, that keeps it in the degraded state. Even if we reduce pollution now, recovery may still be very slow as it has already become resilient to changes because nutrients stored in the lake sediments continue to be released back into the water, and such a process is known as uh, internal loading. Invisibility in time and governance gaps. One reason aquatic ecosystem degradation is so difficult to manage is that much of it is invisible to our eye. Unlike floods or industrial accidents, the damage happens quietly beneath the water surface. Species and ecosystem functions are lost little by little over many years. So the problem often goes unnoticed until the ecosystem is already severely degraded. This makes timely action and effective governance much more challenging. Another challenge is that the warning signs are often subtle. Things like a gradual drop in dissolved oxygen or the slow disappearance of certain fish species don't attract much attention. As a result, authorities often respond only after a major crisis occurs, such as a fish kill that we can see in this figure here. Then toxic algal blooms or drinking water problems. By that stage, the ecosystem has already accumulated years of damage, making recovery much more difficult. Finally, many cases of ecosystem degradation are actually governance failures. Industries such as agriculture, hydropower, and even mining, they often benefit economically, while some of the environmental costs are passed on to the society. The consequences, like polluted water, declining fisheries, and damaged ecosystems. These are usually borne by the local communities, the indigenous people, especially those who depend directly on these water resources, as well as by the future generations. This is why effective environmental governance is just as important as scientific understanding. Many environmental laws were actually created to support the economic development and resource use rather than to protect ecosystems. A detailed and more nuanced information can be found in the module. As a result, policies have often prioritized activities like irrigation, industry, and waste disposal over maintaining ecological health. In addition, water quality standards actually, they are usually based on what is safe for people. But those standards may not be enough to protect the diverse species and the ecological processes that keep aquatic ecosystems functioning. Okay, now we have almost reached the first half of this lecture. From here, we will discuss the ecological and health related issues of water science. I encourage all the students and all the participants to read the module as well. We are participating in this discussion, but I encourage all of you to read the module to get more nuance and more informative knowledge, which can be available in the module content. Okay, so let's look at the ecological consequences of low oxygen levels. When dissolved oxygen drops below 2 milligrams per liter, the water becomes hypoxic. And at this point, most fish and many bottom dwelling organisms struggle to survive. Species that can move will try to escape to areas with more oxygen, but those that cannot, they will often die, resulting in large fish kills and major disruptions of the ecosystem. Hypoxic or dead zones are now actually a global environmental problem. They have been recorded in hundreds of rivers, lakes, and coastal areas around the world, with some growing to enormous sizes. As oxygen levels decline, species begin to disappear, weakening the ecological network. Each species plays a role, whether controlling prey, recycling nutrients, or supporting other organisms. As these roles are lost, the ecosystem becomes less resilient. Food webs, they become simpler, and recovery from the future disturbances become much more difficult, even after pollution is reduced. Public health. Yes, the cyanotoxin threat. One major health concern is harmful algal blooms. which are often caused by cyanobacteria growing rapidly in nutrient rich water. These blooms are becoming increasingly common around the world because of eutrophication. Many cyanobacteria produce toxins which are called microcystins, which primarily damage the liver and can pose serious health risks with long term exposure. These toxins can also accumulate in aquatic organisms, meaning they may move through the food chain and eventually affect both wildlife and humans. Another challenge is that these toxins are difficult to remove. Yes, unlike many bacteria, microcystins are not destroyed by boiling. So, simply boiling contaminated water does not make it safe. Effective removal often requires advanced and expensive treatment technologies. People can be exposed through contaminated drinking water, recreational activities like swimming, or by eating contaminated fish and shellfish. During major bloom events, vulnerable and low income communities are often affected the most because they may not have access to alternative sources for safe drinking water. The economic impact of aquatic degradation. Aquatic ecosystem degradation also has major economic consequences. These are direct costs which are mostly visible to the eye, and such as spending on advanced water treatment technologies and repairing damage to water infrastructure. When water quality declines, cities often need expensive treatment technologies to make drinking water safe. And additionally, invasive species can damage water infrastructure as well, leading to high maintenance cost. There are also indirect costs, which are often even greater, but they are invisible to the eye. When wetlands are degraded, we lose natural flood protection, sorry, and wetlands naturally filter water. Similarly, the loss of ecosystem like coral reefs, they affect fisheries, tourism, and coastal protection from storms, creating long-term economic losses for society. Replacing these natural services like engineered solution is usually far more expensive than conserving the ecosystems in the first place. This is a photo of zebra mussel that most of you must have already seen. It causes enormous damage to infrastructure. Aquatic ecosystem degradation also, you know, I would like to state something bluntly here that aquatic ecosystems do not degrade because nature is fragile. They actually degrade because the powerful economic actors, like we're talking about industrial agriculture, massive developers, hydropower companies, these actors are basically permitted to push the cost of their activities onto our shared water. And this brilliantly, or rather tragically, highlights the core inequality of it all. Because who actually bears the cost, Subsistence fisheries and fishermen's, the rural poor, the indigenous communities, they are the ones left to absorb the devastating impacts of collapsed fisheries and contaminated wells, totally without compensation. Let's ground this in a very concrete example to see how this plays out in real time. Let's move on to our first case study, that is the Toledo toxic crisis. Yes, this is actually one of the best known examples of eutrophications from the 2014 Toledo water crisis case in the United States. High levels of microcystin toxins were actually detected in the city's treated drinking water, and that forced the authorities to issue a do not drink and do not boil advisory that affected about 500,000 people. But why do not boil? We've already learned this, that since these toxins are heat stable, boiling the water was not actually a solution. This crisis caused widespread panic with bottled water selling out within hours. People were panicked. The root cause was excessive phosphorus runoff from surrounding agricultural land, combined with warm conditions that promoted the large harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie. This crisis also highlights an important governance issue here. Pollution from farm is actually called non-point source pollution. I repeat that pollution from farms is actually called non-point source pollution, meaning it comes from many scattered locations rather than a single discharge pipeline. Because of this, it is much harder to regulate and assign the responsibility, like who is to blame. Even if individual farmers following the existing guidelines, the total nutrient pollution entering the lake may still be enough to cause harmful algal blooms. As a result, water treatment plants end up bearing the cost of removing the pollution, and those costs are ultimately passed on to the public, often affecting the lower income communities the most. Let's shift our focus to coral reefs. That is between 2023 and 2025. Globally, we experienced the largest global coral bleaching event that was ever recorded. Around like 84% of reef locations experienced enough heat stress to trigger bleaching, affecting reefs in more than 80 countries and territories. This doesn't mean every coral died, but it does show that heat stress has become widespread and repeated, placing coral reef ecosystems under unprecedented pressure. To understand coral bleaching, we first need to understand the relationship between corals and the tiny algae living inside them. These algae provide most of the corals food and also give corals their bright color. When ocean temperatures become too high, the coral becomes stressed and expels these algae. As a result, the coral turns white, as you can see in in this picture. This process is actually known as bleaching, and it begins to starve this. If the heat stress continues or occurs repeatedly, many corals die before they have a chance to recover, leaving reefs much simpler and less able to support marine life. So coral reef loss is not just an environmental issue. It also has serious impacts on people. Many coastal and island communities they depend on reefs for food because they provide habitat for many fish species. Healthy reefs also support tourism, which is a major source of income for many island nations. In addition, reefs act as natural barriers that reduce the force of waves during the storms. When reefs are lost, communities face declining fisheries, reduced tourism revenue, and greater vulnerability to the coastal erosion and storm damage. Governance mismatch. So, finally, let's look at the governance challenges. Coral bleaching is driven mainly by global climate change, but reef managers can only take local actions, such as reducing pollution or preventing overfishing. These local measures can improve reef health and buy valuable time, but they cannot stop bleaching on their own. This creates a mismatch between the global cause and the local solution. For many island nations, coral reef loss is not only an environmental issue but also a threat to livelihoods, culture, and the national security as well. Even though these countries contribute very little to global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, why traditional policy often fail? The one reason traditional environmental policies often fail short is that they are mainly designed around human needs. Water quality standards usually focus on whether water is safe for drinking or not, or it is safe for swimming or for irrigation. However, water that meets these standards may still be harmful to the aquatic ecosystems. For example, nutrient levels that are considered safe for people can still trigger algal blooms and they can damage the biodiversity. So a river may be legally compliant while its ecological health continues to decline. Another reason is that nature doesn't follow political boundaries. Rivers flow across cities and states and even countries. So pollution created upstream often becomes a problem for communities downstream. There's also a mismatch in the time, which is called temporal mismatch here. Political decisions are usually made with short term goals, such as annual budgets or election cycles, whereas ecosystems they take decades to recover from damage. This makes long term environmental conservation much harder to achieve. By the time the goals are achieved, the government has already changed. The Gulf of Mexico hypoxic zone. Okay, so this is one of the world's best known examples of hypoxia, that is the Gulf of Mexico dead zone. Every year, a massive low oxygen area forms of the Louisiana coast, becoming so large in some areas that it covers over 20,000 kilometers, square kilometers of area. The main cause is nutrient runoff from the Mississippi River basin, where fertilizers from agricultural land are carried into the Gulf. These nutrients fuel algal blooms, and when the algae decompose, they consume oxygen. Warm freshwater also forms a layer over the denser seawater, preventing oxygen from mixing downwards. What's especially challenging is that no single farmer creates this problem. Instead, it results from the combined effects of millions of individual decisions, making responsibility very difficult to assign. Scientists have understood this process for decades, but long term political and economic priorities have made meaningful solutions which are difficult to implement. Aquatic connectivity, the three dimensions of connectivity, yes. So, this is something very important now. So, we'll be talking about aquatic connectivity from here. A healthy river is actually much more than just flowing water. It depends on connections in three dimensions. That is first the longitudinal connectivity, then lateral connectivity, and then the vertical connectivity. What are these? Let's go through one by one. Longitudinal connectivity, first of all, it links the river from its headwater to the sea, and it allows fishes to migrate and sediment to move downstream. Secondly, the lateral connectivity, where rivers connect with floodplains during seasonal floods, creating important habitats for breeding and nutrient exchange. And then finally, the third thing, that is the vertical connectivity. It is the exchange between surface water and groundwater that helps regulate temperature, and it supports many aquatic organisms as well. Human structures like dams, levees, and excessive groundwater pumping, they disrupt these natural connections, fragmenting ecosystems and making it much harder for aquatic species to survive and complete their life cycles. Yes, the Mekong River case, it's actually an excellent example of why connectivity is so important now. Mekong River actually it supports the world's largest inland fishery, and it provides food and livelihood for around 60 million people. Its productivity depends on natural seasonal floods that connect the river with floodplains, such as Tonle Sap Lake, creating ideal breeding habitats for fish. However, the construction of many hydropower dams they have altered the river's natural flow. These dams block fish migration. They trap sediments that would normally reach the delta and reduce seasonal flood pulses. As a result, fish populations decline and the Mekong Delta is now finally eroding. And downstream communities in Cambodia and Vietnam, they bear most of the environmental costs, while many of the economic benefits are gained upstream. I encourage all the participants to look at the module because there's a very clear and very good illustration of what the Mekong River basin was before and after. So one important point is that environmental degradation does not affect everyone equally. Wealthier communities often have the resources to adapt by using advanced water treatment. They buy bottled water or recovering from the environmental damage as well. That is easier for the wealthier communities. Poorer and rural communities usually don't have these options, and they depend directly on rivers, lakes, and fisheries for food and income. In many cases, the economic benefits of projects like dams or large scale irrigation are enjoyed by a small number of powerful groups, while the environmental costs are borne by downstream communities. This means that aquatic degradation is not only an ecological issue, but also a matter of social and environmental justice. To conclude, solving water problems require better governance and not just better engineering. Modern approaches such as integrated water resource management and environmental flows They aim to manage water as a complete ecosystem rather than separating water quality, water quantity, and biodiversity into different sectors. The primary goal is to protect the ecological health of rivers while meeting human needs. Most importantly, we need governance systems that detect problems early before they become crisis and ensure that the costs and benefits of water use are shared more fairly. In the end, long term water security depends on maintaining healthy ecosystems because healthy rivers are the foundation of sustainable societies. So that brings us to the end of today's session. We have seen that protecting water is not just about ensuring enough quantity, but also about maintaining water quality. Yes, they're also about maintaining water quality and biodiversity, ecological connectivity, and effective governance. In our next class, we'll build on these concepts and explore the next stage of aquatic ecosystem management. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next session. If there are any follow up discussions or questions, I request you to post them in the forum W001 and I'll try to engage and answer them. Thank you so much. Have a nice time.